to thank him so much for the travel and for taking the time to come. So with that, Pete Starceski.
Appreciate it. Thanks for having me come in today, and thanks for everyone for giving me the time to talk about incident response. Basically, an open discussion around incident response. I'm treating this more as a roundtable discussion because a lot of you may have questions, not just of me, of each other, because together we learn nowadays from everything that everyone else knows and our experiences, right? So not just from companies like Symantec that do technology and services, right? Because everybody has certain levels of experience. So I appreciate you having me come in. So one of the things we want to do, though, is over the course of today, enlighten your knowledge a little bit more around incident response. A lot of people have a preconceived definition of what it is, and hopefully there's some points where we agree and match on. But most importantly, hopefully, we impart some additional information and wisdom on you to improve the whole process, right, that you use and can enact within your own organization. You know, no matter what the company is, something around incident response is something that touches all of us nowadays, especially with as prevalent as cybersecurity is in the internet, right? So,
well, I actually have the way you opened up is perfect, because I actually have a question that I think is,
okay.
That kind of, from an information systems management perspective, from a CIO perspective, or in anything that has to do with that senior level manager on incident response, what would you say would be those key points that you would have to key into on why they would want to mature their processes and why they would stay on the leading edge of those processes?
Well, I'm glad you mentioned that. It's almost like you'd seen my next slide. So let's go to my next slide. He didn't see my next slide, just so we're all clear. Why might a senior executive or senior management be interested around incident response, basically, and improving that and improving the program as well, right? Well, quite frankly, they want to stay out of the news. They want to stay away from things like breaches, right? I mean, a lot of you read the papers like I do, or read online papers or online information, and gosh, I wish I could tell you that more than a couple of times a week I don't see things related to breach information out there. Unfortunately, it's reality. It's happening a lot more, and companies want to improve their programs around incident response because they'll mitigate the risk as it relates to a breach, which goes to cost, reducing cost, and goes to the bottom line, right? So improves their brand, reduces the cost as it relates to a breach. Make sense?
Makes a lot of sense, yeah.
Terrific. So the other thing is to help everyone understand is, you know, this whole notion of a compromise versus a breach, right? And you know, as this slide says, you have to always, when you talk about the two things, you have to understand there's a differentiation between the two, right? And a lot of people say, oh no, I'm not going to be compromised, you know. So you have to ask yourself the question honestly, or your organization does, is a compromise inevitable, right? Well, it is, and it's not only inevitable, it's probably already happened, right? Because a compromise is not a breach. A compromise generally involves malware where an attack has occurred. So we've all been impacted by that, either at a personal level or a corporate level, or both, right? And probably more than once. And that's going to happen. You have to kind of recognize the fact that that's going to happen. What separates it from a breach is what gets taken. Is the data sensitive and confidential that gets taken, right? I mean, a lot of you have the big breach in the news lately, and I know it's touched the South. I'm hearing about more and more organizations that it's touched, is the Anthem breach, right? A lot of people ask me, and even over the last couple of days, people that I don't even know that I didn't even come to Kentucky to talk to, have asked me, well, you know, what do you think about that? In a way that it was actually one of the better handled breaches over the last year. You know, I know that's not a lot. That's not saying a lot based on the organizations it touches, right? So the other thing as it relates to a breach versus a compromise is you have to be aware of who your business partners are, and that they're also extensions of the roles in incident response. And we're going to talk a little bit more about that, right? So So, you know, within incident response and within a breach, the compromises are inevitable, but what you hope is that compromise does not become a breach, and it all depends on how proactive you are as it relates to dealing with this in your maturity, right? We're going to talk a little bit about that because as you see some of the best practices that we'll go through today, you'll begin to understand the more you invest in the maturity side of incident response, right, you'll, again, mitigate that risk as it relates to a breach. It doesn't mean a breach won't ever happen. It's just that it means the risk or the damage due to it will be minimized.
Well, so for those companies that are out there that are really just, they're maturing, and I mean they may just be $1 or $2 billion companies, but they're maturing, and they really haven't focused on their infrastructure, and they're incorporating information assurance into and risk mitigations into their processes.
Right.
In that maturing process, how do you usually deal with that for those companies who are turning that corner to become more mature in their security posture?
Yeah, we're going to cover that.
Awesome.
So one of the ways is they have to figure out from a model standpoint where they're at, right? And then as part of the incident response process, or I like to call it incident response readiness, they have to judge from a readiness standpoint where they're at so they can begin to improve those gaps, right?
Yeah.
Just like, you know, the whole essence of this is no different for a smaller company versus a bigger company. The only difference is obviously a bigger company organization has more money and sometimes more resources to accomplish what they want to quicker, right? So hopefully that makes sense.
No, that's
okay. Let's go to the next slide and talk a little bit more about this. So so we talked about, you know, compromise versus breaches, right? I'm going to stand up and I'll stay close to the mic here. But what we have to also ask ourselves is, you know, do you really think all instances are the same? Right? I mean, understanding that compromises are in fact not necessarily a breach, right? Then the answer to the question would be no, they're not, right? So if you look at this triangle on the it's being shown here on the presentation, you know, you'll note that so many people, right, focus a lot of their large efforts, right, around where are you spending your money? So where do you think people focus their money and time on?
We focus ours on the bottom one, actually.
Right, and that's you're in the lion's share of people, right? So what that means though is you don't have an infinite amount. So this guy here, Lexmark, and other folks don't have an infinite amount of time to deal with incident response and security in general, right? So if you're focusing a large portion of your time on outbreaks, compromises, right, and investigations, and maybe something that's a little bit more than an outbreak, a suspect compromise, right? Maybe you understand what that means to determine a piece of malware, an outbreak, and a risk there versus a compromise. Do people here understand what the difference is? It's okay if you don't. Okay, some of you do, some of you don't. So the main reason is you have to be able to pick up what indicators of a compromise are. You're going to see, if you're not already reading about that, you need to understand what that is a little bit more. So indicators of compromise can be harvested and from people internally, so you gain a greater understanding as to whether, in fact, a compromise could be heading down the road of being a breach, right, which is the top portion, right? But the reality is most people, if I could draw two circles within that triangle, and I could, except I'd probably get in trouble. I don't know what it would come on. But with that fancy screen up there, right? But if I drew a bottom circle, in a large portion of it would take up the malware outbreak section and most of the suspect compromise section. That's where most people are spending their time, right? Not on the top portion, which, oh, by the way, is probably the most critical area, right? But that's okay. What if you could automate the bottom side a little bit more so you could afford to spend time on the top side? Then you'd have something there and you'd be a little bit better in preparedness or cyber readiness for instances, correct? We all agree with that? Make sense? Let's go to the next slide. So I like this slide for a lot of reasons. It pretty much defines exactly where a customer can see themselves fitting as it relates to incident response and incident response readiness, right? So, I mean, as you look through this, whether it's a crisis mode, elevated concern, or proactive planning, you probably see yourself somewhere here, right? I mean, I wish I could tell you I don't have customers in crisis mode, right? But the reality is I have plenty of customers in crisis mode where they're actually engaged in activities with legal, right, within IT, within media, and they're trying to decide if they can and if they can actually handle the information as it relates to the suspect compromise, which is probably a breach, right? And then they're still deciding whether they should bring a third party into a system on, right? But the key thing there is time is not your friend, right? You have to actually be a little bit more proactive as it relates to that, right? So that's definitely, crisis mode would definitely be a reactive concern. That's what you see a lot in the news, although there are some companies that are getting better, right, that have at least the notion of a retainer with a company. Does everyone here know what an incident response retainer is? It's okay if you don't.
I'm very familiar with it.
Okay. Yeah, and some people are, right? So because likely you've done some research and you've investigated, you're familiar with it, and possibly have one or two. It's pretty common to have, depending on the size of your organization, have more than one entity as a retainer on staff because it gives you flexibility, yeah, right? And generally there's strengths of both organizations and weaknesses, right? So, but a retainer essentially allows you to wrap the entire incident readiness and response activity that you may need to use in the event of a breach, right? We hope you, of course, don't have a breach, right? Into one pre-bought consumable service so that when you need to pull the trigger on the third-party assistance, maybe even to do the supervision level of your team and others in your organization, you'll be able to do that, and there won't be any delays in time. They even, a lot of the times, they have predictive service level, SLAs, which they'll be on site. Some of them even allow you that if you do not use the retainer for a breach, people say, well, I spent all this money, I don't want to lose it, right? You can actually use some of those, or use those hours for a better preparedness. So for things like advanced threat hunting, right, exercises, tabletop exercises, your team and IT and other members of your organization to improve things, right? So in addition to a whole bunch of others. Go ahead. Oh, sorry.
I was just wondering, as a manager, I participated in many response, so that we would have to go to another data center, et cetera. How does, so I'm familiar with those types of SLAs and reports. How does this differ? How does incident management differ from disaster recovery?
Yeah.
Okay.
Or how does it play into the SLA process?
Sure,
right.
Sure. Well, the SLA around incident response is generally geared towards the time from a signed off work order, right? So terms and conditions have already been pre-arranged, pre-agreed to in the retainer, so that it doesn't, you don't have to go to legal. We all know what that does to both organizations, right? But so with terms and conditions identified and the hours already pre-bought with a work order signed, it's that time frame to get the person in air to your destination.
Okay.
So a lot of SLAs within a retainer will have a 2-day or 48-hour, within 48 hours SLA, or within 24 hours, right? So part of it is you're paying for that level of response as well as the amount of hours or weeks in the service.
And then do you have the tabletop run through that steps through the crisis?
Oh, absolutely. So that's initially handled in the triage process up front, where they determine how they're going to use those pre-bought man weeks in, and also, maybe it's of such a serious nature. I'll pick on our friends that make sound and video out in the West Coast, right? We all know what happened to the PlayStation thing and all that sort of jazz, right? That would be a candidate where multiple retainers were used and they still were calling in add-on components, right? So a lot of retainers will get you started, and they're enough for most companies unless it is just a massively global, far-reaching breach. But it doesn't mean that it stops there. The triage process will identify what else is additional.
So does this template have the same ROI as disaster recovery? I mean, you're using the same type of template?
Yeah, absolutely. Good to know. And certainly the spend on an incident response retainer as far as getting it back, it's a matter of what does loss of information cost you, right? And there's several studies out there. I'll pick on one, but there's others as well. There's the Ponymon study where they have a cost per record, and this is just one element of cost, right? There's also the lawsuits. That's tough to figure that one out, right? But so there's a lot of subjective costs as it relates to lawsuits, and most of the lawsuits and most of the losses in a breach don't just come from record losses on average per customer per customer record, but it also comes from the legal cost amount because over a period of years, right? I mean, look, you read in the news, I think they were talking again about, was it the Target breach recently, again, where it's up to $145 million already. So I start to lose count after a while. I'm kind of just shaking my head at that. But the reality is there's no question that legal gets a large portion of the cost, and it's tough to do an ROI on that. But for most customers, they actually have a basis, whether it's a Ponymon document or another document, that basically can tell you what the average cost of record loss is, right? So most organizations have customer data that could be at risk, right? Most do, or other things like intellectual property, right? So there's an average cost per record, and that's probably a good indicator for ROI. But ROI is definitely tough. But I would say that most use that indicator because the legal side and estimating legal costs is very difficult, right?
What I was going to say is, if you look at legal and you bring legal into this, what I've seen is in many cases, depending upon the size, if it is an actual breach, legal will actually run the incident response. And having retainers in place, and multiple retainers, I might add, is not just a question of if you do it. If you don't do it, what can happen is you see an indicator in your environment. You discover that you have compromised systems. You're starting your dispatch to figure out, where am I at in this situation? Have I actually experienced a breach? Once you get to the point that you think you have experienced a breach, whether it be the intent of the indicator, like you get a indicator from, let's say, a government agency, and the government agency indicator says if you have this in place, chances are you're experiencing a breach. If you don't have those retainers in place to get on that immediately, that breach can spread. So at the point of having those folks on retainer, it's not just a matter of being able to do the follow-up, but it's literally being able to stop the breach from occurring with the with slowing it down.
Right. Yeah.
So I got a question. In your experience, are certain verticals better at incident response than others, or is it a very personal thing with kind of a company-by-company basis?
Yeah, I mean, I definitely think it's more the latter, and I certainly wish I could tell you the other thing, to be honest with you, but I think part of it is, it's not always, too, based on size. I mean, a lot of people would think that a larger company they always have a better incident response, but there's plenty of companies at all sizes. The term in the world is called the ostrich syndrome, when they feel that they have their head in the sand, right, like in ostrich does, that the issue will go away. And I wish I could tell you there was a healthcare entity represented in the room. They're our host, right? I had a customer, well, they weren't really a customer, but we had gone on and done some awareness for them on, things they need to be concerned about. And there's regulatory reasons too, right? A lot of us are bound by those requirements as well, whether you're government or bound by government regulations in healthcare, finance, or other industries as well, right? And these guys would not believe that, they felt that it was a doom and gloom message being preached, and we even had a member of the HIPAA board there explaining things to them who had nothing to lose by explaining stuff to them, and they were, all four executives were completely in denial of it, right? Come to find out a year later, which is also another most popular pathway where people find out about a breach, is an outside entity, government entity, mentioned to them. It was the FBI, said that do you realize you're breached, and they explained why, and they went in, and it led to other causes, and it led to the guy that was doing the HIPAA validation for regulatory requirements. And you can imagine how it snowballed. So the reality of that is, I would say, organizations can judge their maturity basically by at least knowing, right, that they actually have to investigate more time and readiness in it. So the only way that they do that is through a baseline assessment, right? There are a lot of organizations that do that. A lot of consulting companies do that. Actually, there's one here in the local area I know that does it. So, and you have to start there. You have to find out where you're at from a cyber readiness standpoint. Good question.
And does Symantec offer that capability to be able to get you on a glide path?
We do.
From wherever you are in your maturity process?
We do. We do. And we provide gap definitions and paths to get you there, right? Obviously, then at that point in time, the company has to implement that, right? Execution is important, right? So the other thing we can talk about is, so as we step through crisis, elevated concern, and proactive planning, everybody wants to get to the last side, right? Proactive planning means you're going the route of a retainer. You probably have a pretty mature security staff. That's another thing. What does that mean? We'll talk about that in a second. Because skilled staff is one thing. Having staff is a whole nother, right? And it's no basis for that. Everybody can improve it. Everybody that has high-level talent has gaps, as well as people that are trying to get more skills, right? We all can improve, and that's also part of a cyber readiness program, because it's not something that's visited once for incident response. It's something that's iterative, that makes, obviously, by slow improvements in the organization, it makes, or people in the organization, it makes the organization better. Make sense? Okay. Thank you, though, for those questions. So let's go ahead and talk about the next slide. So, or not. Pay no attention to the man behind the curtain. There we go. And this is kind of what we actually talked about. I'm actually going to walk away from the mic, so I'll have to yell a little bit or talk loudly. So, to understand where you're going, you have to understand where we suspect, all of us in the room, where incident response is today. Some of this should start to look familiar to some of you, right? Especially if you have activities and you've done these, right? Whether you're talking about, hey, you believe you have a problem because the incident response team was called in, right? And slowly but surely, there's a lot of ramp-up time, right? Whatever that means. People getting coordinated to get in, get on a phone call, if they're virtual. But one thing's for sure, most companies have a process around manual correlation of evidence still in place. You may be a company that's the exception to that, where you have some automation in place, and that's great. But I would challenge you that you probably have still some manual evidence that's being correlated, right? In addition to maybe a little automated evidence, right? And then you were just talking about it, right? Do we call that external team? Do we have a handle on this? What do you think? We think we understand it, but we're not quite there. And if you don't have a retainer in place, what does it mean? Well, you have to actually go seek an emergency activity right? And then it's a best effort generally by companies, whether it's Symantec or another company, to come and assist you, right? Because the retainer, again, gives you that guaranteed SLA, right? So, and then what that does is it causes delays and ramp, right, to achieving, working the actual incident and doing incident management, right? And there's costs associated with that, right? So let's go ahead and go to the next slide. Okay, I'm going to move back to the center now. So I told you I was going to do both since you gave me the option. So let's talk a little bit about what is involved in the goals of incident response, right? Everyone thinks they know, but I think it bears necessary reasons to review it so everybody's on the same page. And I'll tell you where I'm getting the basis of this from. So not surprisingly, it's you need to adopt a standard or standard framework for incident response management, right? So understanding that, right, the key thing is what? Overall is minimizing the damage and restoring the organization to normal operations, normal business operations, right? A lot of different capabilities that you'll read out there around that. Some will touch on some of the things in the NIST standard for incident handling. That's what we advise customers to leverage. Not surprisingly, that's what a lot of governments leverage, right? It's a great standard, right? And so although some will do some lighter elements of it, it'll be it can be encapsulated in that framework to be leveraged in it, just like it can on the accounting side of the business, right? So investigation, right, and remediation are the two major steps as it relates to and activities as it relates to work in an incident. But you know, with any investigation you're going to do, and we're going to talk about this when we talk about the framework a little bit, you're going to do not only diagnosis and analysis, you'll do some containment as well, and you also do preliminary containment. We'll talk about that and what that means. And then as a part of the remediation process, when you're doing containment, you'll do mitigation and remediation, and you'll do containment, mitigation, and remediation, and you'll do containment, mitigation, and remediation. It'll be a constant thing you'll notice you're doing, because what you'll find out working an overall incident is it's never just one little thing, right? Not nowadays. Maybe 10, 14 years ago it was a little bit like that, possibly, and companies probably weren't doing incident response then anyway, right? So the other thing you have to ask yourself is, what do you think else should be involved in a more comprehensive incident response? And what are we missing so far? We talked about a lot of things. We're already giving you a few ideas regarding not only the goal, but what the primary activities are. So let me put that idea in your mind. So start thinking about what might be missing. A lot of you people in the room are IT people. Who's all IT people in the room? Pretty much everybody. I'd love to, every time I do this, we've done roundtables before, I love to see it when somebody has their hand down and says, no, I'm from legal or I'm from HR. Because actually they should be invited to stuff like this. Absolutely. Who on the phone is from IT? Are you all from IT?
They're all from IT.
Yep.
Are they allowed to chime in or no?
They have a microphone.
Oh, they are, okay.
So if you're in your company and you see this, you identify this. I mean, everybody at this level in these meetings knows about DR and business continuity and incident response. And if you see your organization not executing well, do you have suggestions on how to get that conversation started with legal or the board, or you know, how do you move the ball forward?
Well, yeah, the bigger question I have is most everything that we do, especially in a constrained environment in the government side right now, we have to develop business cases. For every area that we choose we have to prioritize, develop the business case and how it applies into our continuity of operations and threat mitigation. And my question is how do you get it to the budgetary side in a meaningful way? Because that to me is where the rubber meets the road with this.
Sure. Yeah, well, that's what I'm asking. Do you go to the COO? Do you go to general counsel? Who's going to be the champion? Who's got the most skin in the game?
The advocate for this,
that's right,
is your legal counsel.
100%.
And what you do is you take and you look at, let's say, one of the recent breaches, whether it's Anthem or Sony, you go back to your management and you say, we are at risk in these areas. And then you go back to your legal counsel, make sure they're aware of it. And as you're talking to them in the risk that you're facing as a business, you have to help them to sell to management. When I say management at C-level, you have to help them sell that at such a level that they understand the risk that you're running by not having incident response in place could extend a breach. It's one thing if you have a breach and you contain it fairly well. It's another thing when it runs rampant.
Right.
Then you're really talking, that's where you get into the $140 million scenarios.
And what it does to your reputation is almost instrumental.
Right. I mean, healthcare's in the room. I mean, I spent a lot of time working for a healthcare provider, all right, so I can relate to what you're doing. And but yeah, brand on any business, but really healthcare, I can't even explain, right? You can imagine if your healthcare organization is known for this and this and this, and they all have specialties, right, across the nation, right? You know, they're always rating each other as hospitals #1 in this, right? But if people go to you for that, globe or across the nation, sometimes globally. I mean, there's people, for example, there's people over in the Middle East come all the way to the Cleveland Clinic in Ohio for surgery or on cardio because they're the best, right? If that brand becomes tainted, I picked on them not intentionally, but only because I know that they also have operations globally. They're probably one of the few U.S. healthcare providers that has a global operations outside of the U.S. They actually brand would be impacted. A lot of movie stars, right, celebrities, right, go to places like that, and that will negatively impact you, mainly because if that becomes less, those people are in the public eye. So now you got two things going for you, against you, excuse me. You have somebody that's in the public eye that would talk, well, no, I probably won't go to that, and who knows what they might say, right? They're in the press limelight all the time. So yeah, definitely image and brand is very important. So, but legal, as I've mentioned, consistently remains the largest amount of cost for a breach. And it won't be the only cost, but it's certainly the largest cost. So not surprisingly, they would be a very, very, very strong advocate, right? As well as people in at the operations level, right? They have to care. Let me say it this way: everyone cares about the image of the company they work for, but they have the responsibility of the brand, which is probably the president and/or COO. I'll say it that way. Not that the CEO isn't, but that's more in line with the president and COO because that's why they're hiring that position, right? So, or if you're in healthcare, it would be what's it called? A non-for-profit. It's not a CEO, but I'll think of it. Anyway, I thought somebody would bring it up. So let's talk a little about, though, because this also, what we were talking about, factors into the next area we want to talk about regarding incident response. So if you go to the next slide, we'll talk about that before we talk about infrastructure, is who should be involved in the process? Well, we were trying to talk about that, right? So it's certainly, everyone in the room, we've already talked about this, it's multifaceted, right? In my opinion, yeah, a lot of people, like you'd indicated, sir, that legal can lead a incident response. I don't know whether I 100% agree with that, but they're certainly strategic to the people that are leading it, whether it's the company themselves, meaning they're right there with them, right? But it starts and ends with a core investigative team, whatever that defines for the company, right? This is a very simple model, what you see displayed here, but it's generally a cross-section of organizational units within the company, right? That's the key thing there. So if you show them even this simple diagram, and I'm not saying any company in the room is simple, but there's if you go beyond being a national company, if you're a global company, I'm picking this guy here, I know they are, some of you are as well probably in the room, that changes things a little bit, right? Because the impact could be greater, right? And you certainly have disparate infrastructure across the globe, right? So generally it starts here as a simple one. If you kind of go to the next slide, there are also other structures for incident response, right? Some of you may claim you have a central incident response team. And it may be completely made up of people in IT. I would challenge you to include other members of your organization because it's probably more of an outbreak team. And that's okay, but you know, central incident response team is very critical to a company. The other areas for structure, though, are things around, you know, whether the team should be, in fact, distributed or not. So if you have a large global team, right, that tends to be the case. Not mentioning the company, a very large global multi-billion-dollar company has an extended or distributed incident response team where you know, it's based on and their team based on geographic region, right? And they actually try to align some sort of follow the sun model with the other teams that they have. You know, much the same way somebody that would be monitoring their security, right? Kind of makes sense, right? The incident response team should go lockstep with the team that's monitoring security, right? Whether it's internally or externally, doesn't matter, right? So, so definitely a large global company with great reach, right? Or even a company that, even the U.S. nationally, that might be run based on West, Central, East, could qualify for a distributed incident response team. You certainly want to figure out what makes the most sense. But obviously a 4-hour time shift is not a big deal. Every 8 hours and having infrastructure in other continents, that's a little bit bigger deal, right? What we start to see is for companies that are more mature, they tend to have more mature as it relates to incident response and security in general, tend to foster a distributed team, okay, a little bit. But they also tend to gravitate towards a coordinating team, right? So, or working with a coordinated team, right? So whether it's a third party or whatever, and that's where you'd execute something like you know, an incident response retainer, or if you didn't have a retainer in place, an emergency activity for incident response, right? Makes sense? Staffing models, not surprisingly, for most organizations who involve their own employees, the key thing there being, as you saw from the prior slide, needs to be members of your extended organization. I mean, you saw 5 or 6 good examples, and I think those pretty much cover it. But definitely the most common favorite ones that you'll hear brought up in the press are legal and media. Media meaning public relations. IT is of course always involved, right? So, and then the other key thing there is finding everyone has the ability to improve their security knowledge, right, in IT, and you know, a lot of you have awareness programs or working on awareness programs in your own organization. But the go-to people in incident response are probably your sharper security and IT folks because of the demand for time, and it's very stressful, right, when you're working through that. So that's something to note. For that reason, too, some companies do some partially outsourced capabilities of their staff as it relates to an incident response team. And what might be a partially, I kind of already touched on it, but what might be a partially outsourced staff that would be an extension of your incident response team? Not the retainer side, so not the actual response. The SOC. I shouldn't have took the answer from you. You used to work for my company, so. But yes, absolutely. A MSSP, a managed and monitored security service provider, could be an extension of your team, right? Where they're actually doing incident or event monitoring and incident prioritization and correlation for you with actionable intelligence, and they're creating a gap, right? So your team can actually do work on the remediation side and all the other protection technologies. Because there's enough work to go around. So it's pretty common. It's actually becoming more common, and something like that on a partially outsourced model would be definitely something that a smaller company would go for, right? We're seeing a lot of activity from the small and medium size because they just can't afford to. First of all, they can't afford to not do it. They can't be the ostrich with the head in the sand, right? But they, you know, they have to actually accommodate it, and being able to build a business case around justifying partially outsourced makes sense. And of course, attaching with that incident response makes a lot of sense, right? Some do fully outsourced, right? Can you ever fully, I actually argue with my own team about this. Can you ever fully outsource incident response?
No.
Absolutely correct. Because the responsibility never gets fully outsourced, right? So that shell organization we talked about, so if you kind of go back, go back one slide? That shell, I call it that shell organization for incident response on the outside there, probably the most important, not just the core investigating team. That core investigating team, which may or would be, it could be an outsourced entity, right, leading it, or two, or however many, may involve folks within that outer balloon there, right? And in actuality, one of those balloons might be also, if you're doing outsourced security monitoring, might be a balloon for that, right? So, but in no way, shape, or form can you ever fully outsource the responsibility for incident response. So go ahead, 2 slides. Okay. So, this is the methodology we would definitely recommend all customers follow if they're going to do incident response themselves. This is the methodology we adopt. Okay, it's the NIST IR methodology for incident handling, right? So, key thing here, I'm going to move up here a little bit. You didn't think you were going to get a workout. So, key thing here being the various stages, right, that you need to go through, right? If you're doing this yourself, or that you should expect an outsourced entity to leverage, right, is the ability to initially do diagnosis of the incident first. And then being able to do that quickly with a containment strategy, very important, right? That's the speed that you need. That's why there were a lot of people flying down here, right? And we were, I forget the person. Oh, they were coming down here to talk to somebody about the Anthem breach, which I thought was interesting. She was a consultant, it was a gal. I thought, oh, this is great. What's the chances of somebody sit next to me on an airplane for that, right? But specifically, she had indicated, people actually thought that 3 days was too long on containing a breach. And I said, well, based on track records of what we've seen in the news, 3 days is pretty good, to be honest with you, right? If in fact it was 3 days, some are arguing that it was between 1 and 3 days. It's really what happened in that time frame that's most important, right? Because it doesn't take people, adversaries that are compromising you and breaching you, right, to take valuable information out, right? But certainly lesser days to contain it is better than more. We would all agree with that, right? So it's important to basically be able to gather the live data, right? And also that may be forensic information, also analyze it and provide a containment strategy. But the next step very quickly is to do analysis on it so you determine, okay, what from a broader standpoint helps me identify what the impact of this is, right? Which allows me to get into then when I know that and I know that impact, I then can get into the containment, mitigation, and remediation. Containment, mitigation, and remediation. So you'll probably be saying that over in your head after you leave here today. I hope so, because it is an iterative process. The third stage, you're very iterative, but you're only capable of doing that, right, if you've done and executed a proper diagnosis and analysis and come up with a containment strategy. Very important, right? Because that allows you to do what? It's not the last thing. It's the next to the last thing is to restore the organization to normal operations, right? And are we done after we do that? No. Some of you know that. We're not done. What's some of the things that we do next? All the post-incident stuff, right? So what might be some of that stuff? You can even,
On the DoD side, we go through and we do an after-action review where we look at all the teams interacting with each other, and were there any of the gaps that we found, how do we effectively fill the gap and automate the process where we have better containment so that we can either stop them at the gate
Right.
when they come through, that those things are automatically seen. The flags are raised properly.
Good.
And then we test it.
Absolutely.
And make sure that that countermeasure works.
Right. Validate your containment strategy, in fact, is working, right? So period of time, that's a good point. And post-incident activity where you actually, this is even before you do your report and archive your data, right, in case it needs to be used by either management or law enforcement or something like that. You basically want to make sure your containment strategy and your remediation stuff is working. So there's a period of time that goes on. Most popularly, it's not locked into a week, but generally it depends on the extent of the breach. It's obviously a more global breach. So if you're a globally focused company, the time frame might be more, and that generally is determined in the containment strategy.
Usually on the DoD side as well, they go, those kind of incidents become part of their annual test that they do on systems. When they test penetration, or they test any kind of vulnerability, or they test their continuity of operations and what happens when a breach occurs, all these models all now become part of it.
Right. Oh no, I agree. And then you add that into like an improvement plan for self-improvement as well, right? So that if you have a incident response plan and then a program, we're going to talk about that. There's a difference, right? So we all know plenty of people that plan. Even my wife gets on me about planning to do a lot of things, guys, right? But my execution is never as good as my plan. But I've got a great plan. So, yes, ma'am.
So then when we were talking about a retainer,
Mm-hmm.
Would pen testing be part of that retainer? Is that proactive piece? Is that included in that?
I would say no. Pen testing is more of a
More internal?
more of a, well, there's not more. It's more of a focused activity. It also is more of a
Compliance issue, really.
yeah. It's compliance, but it's also more of a. It could be internal from the standpoint of it's stuff that you should either be doing or have an outsourced entity be doing. Actually, a lot of companies that do outsource that, they'll insource the inside stuff and have somebody do the outsource on the external side. So they're doing it both ways, right? Because a lot of people don't realize. I was talking to a company and they said, "Oh, well," they said, "We don't do pen testing out." I go, "You don't? Why not? The threats do, right? The threats aren't one way, so you have to go both ways. And obviously, it's easier to kind of split the duty that way. So generally, it's not. Did you have comments, sir?
Yeah, I was going to say within the incident response at the end, when you're doing what we call lessons learned, you go back and you look, how did the retained party basically function? Did they have a game plan? Did they do what they were expected to do? Did they do it as quickly as you expected them to do it? When they had to put, let's say, boots on the ground, were they able to respond to what your demands were? And, if you go back and you review that and the lessons learned, what you may find out is that you need to increase your retainers. You may need to switch companies, those kinds of things. And a lot of times you don't hear about that. But from a pen testing perspective, what you really use the retainer for in a lot of cases is to figure out the root cause of the compromise as close as you can, because you may not have the expertise in-house to be able to figure that out. That's where I see a lot of companies having trouble.
And to add to that too, the validation aspect. So once you have, if you've figured out the root cause of things, you have to validate your containment strategy, right? You have to know what you have, right? So part of it is they do test for that. So that's part of that activity. So it's not that let's monitor and see what happens, right? They can actually, if they know what it is, they can actually test for it. And as part of the incident, they also find out where you were weakest or where the entry points were, so they would test for it at those locations. So it's similar. It's kind of the same, but it's not a full-out pen test.
So in government, we do two sides, right? We do a functional, which is all the NIST process.
Okay.
And then that rapidly migrates once you're done with the post-incident activities, goes right into the operational.
Right.
I mean, that goes right back into the functionals of making sure you get your legal review, your budgetary review, and all the other reviews. Is that something that's similar in other businesses? Is that how y'all do functional, operational, or are they kind of melded together?
No, it's something we'd advocate. So to your point, when we talk about retainer, I keep mentioning, think of cyber readiness same as incident response readiness. Same. Some would argue, but it is the same. In one, the outcome of post-incident activity should go back into that readiness again, so that you know. So you talk about BCP and stuff, right? You know exactly what to test yourself for with the frequency you want to get to. It's certainly annually, but I'll go on record saying I think it should be by the companies that are more mature, just like you would do with DR, right? Twice a year, right? So would you handle an incident any less? No. It is data. What do they take it? Data. So.
I mean, in that same respect, I mean, having not actually been in management for incident response, but been in management with disaster recovery, trying again to correlate those templates, since they're both recovering from some type of disaster, and knowing the proactive work that we did on DR, put the test in place, test your plan,
right,
so that you're not.
Well, and that's a great point. So retainers, I know he knows this. He's not interviewing, just so you guys know, but he could. No. Retainers actually have incident response testing as an alternate activity that can be leveraged in a retainer. So if you're not faced with a breach and you've already done your cyber readiness assessment, because you have to do that to understand a baseline, you go back and do testing on it later in the year, right? And so they can do incident response testing and tabletop exercises, right? Where so part of that would be where you're actually doing, you're playing the offensive guy, the adversary on the outside. So you're not pen testing, but you're doing more than that. Because pen testing is really kind of has a weird bad name in the enterprise, because people think of it as, well, you're scanning and doing this, right? But it's a whole lot really offensive. Is they'll do whatever they have. They basically move laterally. I think having ability to move laterally is most important. A lot of times you just garner information that you get from pen testing, so it's a little bit more than that. So they can help you with tabletop exercises from the offensive side and defensive side. Most of us spend our time doing defense, right? But to understand how to better do things defensively, you need to play on offense, right? Because it gives you a different perspective, defending yourself against it, right? Make sense? Great, good input, appreciate it. So let's go to the next slide. Yes, moving along. James, do we need to take a break? Is this a good point to take a break?
No, we're good.
Okay. So this is where we want to get to, right? So you've been exposed to how to build the teams out, what roles should be involved, what the framework is, right? We want to get to this area, and some people may say, hey, yeah, we're doing this prioritize correlated alerts. Well, maybe, right? I hope you are. Absolutely hope you are, right? But you also need to do this, right? So it's not enough to look at prioritized correlated alerts, because what you'll still find out is you have a lot of those, and you're chasing maybe false positives and stuff like that. That's why you have to triage it, and to do it in an automated fashion would be great, right? You need to have some human triage. Why is that? Why would you do triage on a prioritized incident before you raise the flag of I have an issue?
Validation.
Of
procedures.
Of your assets, value maybe, and criticality, and yeah, well, absolutely.
Whenever we do our triage, it's really to see if the breach or the intrusion was, how long it's been there, to see what is affected. And immediately start working multiple tracks at the same time.
But you even want to know, so part of this activity, because collaborative triage might involve other parties as it relates to what you're talking about. But prior to that, you want to make sure that if I love picking on assets, because almost nobody knows the assets that they have in their organization at any one point in time, right? That's the type of society we've become, because we're so dynamic, we're so moving, whether you're a business in healthcare or your business in manufacturing, doesn't matter. We try to keep our pulse on all our assets, but what you really need to keep your pulse on is not so much that, it's all of your critical assets. That's your highest risk point. Start there, right? And that also tells me that if a compromise or a pending breach was impacted on a non-critical asset, I just probably can decommission it, right, and redo it. It suffers from a little bit different approach unless you want to garner some forensic information from it to communicate during collaborative triage, right? But the good news is we want to get to where we're doing prioritized, automated triage and workflow based on things like, what's my infrastructure look like? What's its value, right? And other things. And then I do a collaborative triage, possibly with an external party that you bring in to lead it. If you need to go this far, you may find out you don't, right? And then what that gives you is the bottom section here. We go left to right. And the most important thing is building a real-time update for information and collaborative response, right? So this also more starts to look like a managed incident response, right? You'll hear MER from actually a competitor from us, but a good company. But managed incident response is where everyone and where the market's getting to. Two things will get in the way of that: your maturity or a lack of desire to improve your maturity, because you can have the best processes and capability and technology out there available to you, right? But your maturity has to get there, right? You have to get yourself there. That's part of why we're talking about things today. So, so this is what we hope the incident response tomorrow will look like, right? So if we're doing all those things, right, we build an incident response team in some form or fashion. If you go to the next slide, the next thing we want to ask is, these are really my open discussion questions, right? Normally I deliver that first set of slides in like 10 minutes. I like the interaction, and I don't stop it because sometimes you don't get interaction when you come here, right? So as you look at this list of questions for discussion, some of these jump out at you, right? Some of them we talked about, how to gauge law enforcement and outside assistance, Who would do that in the organization?
Security.
They would, but who ultimately would be involved with them? You already mentioned it. They're involved in...
Oh, you're talking about legal. Actually, in cases that we've experienced, legal will instruct our security who has the relationship with
law enforcement.
Right. Oh, and definitely.
Right. Oh.
This is all stakeholder level stuff.
Yeah, absolutely, absolutely. What other things jump out at you here? Does anybody here have
cyber insurance?
Yeah, I've never. Explain that.
This is big now. I think there's a lot of my customers.
Something you can research and invest in, right? The big element is how do you determine, what's enough? Well, what's enough, right? Part of that is understanding when you go through cyber readiness, you'll understand more about where you're at gap points, but also where your critical stuff's at. And then once you understand that, you can place some costs to that, and that will feed into that. It won't be the only element, because then you'll have to also involve one entity we're going to involve? Legal. Now people know. Now people know why I didn't become an attorney for it, guys.
But now you're sharing the risk as well, right?
Right. Absolutely. So the other thing is, I'm sure all of you have incident response programs in the room, right? All of you. I'm not trying to put anybody out, or on the phone. I'm not trying to put anybody on the hot pot here, hot stand. But the reality is, it's okay if you don't, right? Because it begins and starts with a plan. But the key thing is you have to turn a plan into a program. If you're not doing it, you need to at least be heading down that road, right? So how do you do that? What's involved in that? We talked about some of it, right?
All the stakeholders initially that you talked about bringing to the table, that's our responsibility.
Absolutely. So
And any other outside organizations that you deem appropriate.
Right. So who organize that? Typically, whether you're not involving a outside organ, whether you're involving an external entity or not, you have essentially project management that does that. Somebody on your side and somebody on the external side as well. So you have sources go. That's also where your key stakeholders, who they work with, right? That way, it also eases the pain and the anxiety, and also all the tasks to deal with all the high-level, I call it risk points with communication outside your organization, right? And that group also resolves disputes, and they keep executives in the organization and the board informed, right? Very important, right? So you also need things like the ability to do things like case management, workflow. You're going to have a lot of information coming in. So, yeah, perfect.
Yes, that's a good point too. I mean, as we're looking for staff and people to bring on to the team, we're looking at NCSEs and CISSPs and things of that nature. But there are a number of incident response certifications that are out there today. CERT has them, SANS has them, GIAC has them. So, those are very valuable people in today's world. And those are also things that we could be offering our own employees to, retain them, keep them happy, and things of that nature.
As well as to, certifications do a lot of things. They don't just get you a check in the box and looks great on your resume, right, or LinkedIn profile. It's not just that. It's makes you better, more valuable to your organization, right? So a lot of companies, the big market now, what James is bringing up is, in addition to SANS, actually Symantec's entering this market March 2nd, I think, where we're actually bringing, this is my one shameless plug, I only did two. One shameless plug is, it's exciting because a lot of companies want to do cyber readiness activities on their own premise. We actually do that. I've done it, not just regionally, but globally, okay? We do it internally. We practice it internally as well through cyber war games. So we're bringing the expertise and all the technology that we garnish from that, and offensive and defensive capabilities, and a software as a service model for security simulation platform. So you can actually you'll be able to go online with your organization and subscribe to, generally based on number of users and missions, and run your organization through this themselves, right? And it uses a little gamification dashboard, so it's competitive. I know Madison over here. He doesn't look very competitive, but he's that guy with his arms crossed. But everybody likes to play games amongst your peers. Pretty common, right? So it makes it kind of more of an interesting activity. Am I picking on him in the wrong way? Okay. No. So. Cool. So, no, that's important, right? So the other thing is we want to bring out is you have to know, we talked a little about this, you want to know your assets. So you want to have a skills inventory of everything that you have from a technology standpoint, everything about it, including if it has a compliance requirement or it's got a compliance-related asset, right? And then you want to have a list of vendors that you need to work with. Somebody brought that up. So we think about, when you think of an incident response activity, you think of so much about you dealing with a company that can assist you with the IR, but all the other vendors you have technology with, Cisco, Symantec, Microsoft, et cetera, right? You need to have not only a list of them, but context, people you can involve in case it's something related to their technology. Right? So you're also going to have your playbook handy as it relates to building a program, right? And you're going to do what? You're going to have a retainer in place. That's certainly what we recommend from a proactive standpoint. Something you need to start looking at. There's some very affordable options as it relates to that. I talked about this earlier, business context. So I talked about all the assets you have. Assets are many different things, right? But you got to understand the business context. There's leadership that helps you with that. There's technology out there that helps you with that, data loss prevention, right? Technology helps you identify the context, the business context of an asset. If you don't know, it can help you with that, right? And there's elements of that. And then lastly, when you have this put into place as a program, the only way it succeeds is to get what from management, Buy-in from management, absolutely. Way up top, right? And then you constantly, as a part of the program, right, you what? This young lady mentioned it. You test it, practice it, right? I mean, I'll challenge all of you, if you're doing it as much as your DR plan, that's wonderful. Start there. Most organizations can't do DR quarterly. Some are trying, right? It's just hard, timing and resource-wise and all that. So let's go to the last slide, then we'll wrap things up. I think it's the last one. So the choice, hopefully you had some knowledge, heard some knowledge about incident response and what you do and what are best practices as it relates to that. But the choice is yours, right, whether you're going to be proactive or reactive. You could be here just getting your CPE credits, right, and not care about things, right? Or you can take some of this and say, hey, what are we doing here, right? Even if you're not the person up top, you can impact some of that change, right? Everyone can, right? Every member of the organization can impact that. So you can decide, this is my other shameless plug, of course. You can be one that does proactively for a retainer involving a reputable third party. Symantec, hopefully you think we're reputable. Maybe not James. I try to be a little bit more reputable, James. All right, we're going on. The other thing is, of course, if you happen to be reactive, we'll still, of course, help you like so many entities, but there's a risk, as this young gentleman pointed out, there's a risk for being reactive, right? Time delays, and delays are not something that's on your side as it relates to dealing with it. Right? Want more information about what we do, go to our website or talk to James or myself, and we'd be happy to come in and talk to you about specifically what we offer. So, thanks.